We shall a very warm good morning to all of you. We shall begin the 12th MJM Memorial Lecture on 16th, that is today, in AC College, in the presence of honorable guests we have with us today. We have Sri Chukka S. Ratnam Garu, Secretary MJM Memorial Committee. I welcome him. We have Sri T. Rangarao Garu, President MJM Memorial Committee. We welcome you, sir, on behalf of the college. And we also welcome Sri K.S. Lakshman Rao Garu, MLC, Vice President, MJM Memorial Committee. We welcome Dr. A. Leela Mohan Rao Garu. We welcome Sri Vijay Kumar Garu, the son of M.J. Manikya Rao Garu and his wife, into our midst, and several other important people like lecturers, former principals, retired principals, and each and everyone. We heartily welcome to our college to this 12th MJM Memorial Lecture, and we look forward to the topic of listening to the topic of role of state in implementing equitable and sustainable higher education. That is going to be delivered by Professor D. Narasimha Reddy. He is a noted development economist, professor of economics and former dean of School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad. At this juncture, I want to say just one word from the Bible, that is, the memory of the just is blessed. అంటే నీతి మంతుల్ని జ్ఞాపకం చేసుకోవటం ఒక బ్లెస్సింగ్ అని చెప్తున్నాను. We all know what we are today is because of late Sri MJM Manikya Rao Garu and his efforts. Otherwise, I don't know where we could have all been. So once again, we congratulate the Memorial Committee, the efforts they are putting in for remembering his efforts, and the spirit is with us. His spirit, we should continue the spirit of Sri MJM Manikya Rao Garu, so that even in the future, in the present scenario of a new education policy, we are going to see drastic changes in the education sector, and unless and until we gear up for these changes, we'll be nowhere. And sometimes there may be loss, sometimes there may be some benefits, but however, we should look at the greater interest of the lecturers, so that many people can be benefited. So with these few words, I welcome you all to participate in this Zoom meeting. Thank you. The next on the, we have the second program is a background to the webinar, Dr. S. Shankar, EC member, MJM Memorial Committee, and he will be talking about the background to the webinar. Over to Dr. S. Shankar.
Good morning to you all. Thanks to the principal of AC College, Guntur, for hosting this webinar from their college, and to our own member, Moses, for taking initiative for organizing this from their college in these pandemic times. The MJM Memorial Committee has been mulling over on how to organize the 12th Memorial Lecture, which falls today. And several rounds of discussions have been held with like-minded people, identifying the topic and calling for a resource person. Rangarao Garu, SRK Prasad have given us liberty to me and Leela Mohan Garu to finalize this topic, but at each stage, they have involved themselves in giving our giving us suggestions. And the topic for today's webinar is New Education Policy 2020, the role of state in implementing equitable and sustainable higher education. Chukai Suratnam Garu, the secretary, has always been kind and never interrupted us in our discussions. He gave us a free hand. Whether he spoke it or not, that's a different thing in giving his assent. But we were given ample freedom to frame this topic and to take other measures to organize this in a venue which is convenient for the elderly, and also getting a Zoom link, you see, through AC College and Dr. Moses. A lot of discussion has taken place in different colleges, universities, public forums on the New Education Policy 2020. But as ACTA has been all through interested in reminding the governments, whether it is the government at the center or at the state, the role that has to be played by the governments in implementing equitable and sustainable higher education. Rangarao has been instrumental in making this organization, the MJM Memorial Committee, function at its peak, and to take a proactive step in meeting people, talking to them, traveling if need be to different venues. You all know that MJ Manikar, fondly referred to as MJM, we called him the father of college teachers movement in Andhra Pradesh. He was a teacher MNC and advisor of ACTA AP, and he believed that our education should not make the students to live in isolation. It is in this context that the topic today has become very important. The concern of the institutions of higher learning should not be about creating just global leaders, but to make them human beings. That's what MJM believed. And he believed that the efforts of the teacher should aim at giving importance to creative activity in our curriculum, which can expand young people's minds. The NEP promises to look into all these issues, and we have made available the draft of the new education policy in PPT form. And also we have abridged it to see to use it for today's webinar. It is available on MJM committee group and RCT groups, retired college teacher groups of various places. And it can be accessed either in draft form from the UGC website or in the PPT form, you see, in all these groups to which I made a reference. I request all the members to kindly look at the PPT that will be shared from AC College, if possible, and also listen to the illustrious Professor D. Narasimha Reddy garu, who was kind enough to accept our invitation, and all the efforts to call him to this webinar are with Leela Mohan garu. Now the program is like this. After my remarks, the secretary of the MJM Memorial Committee, Chukka Esaratnam garu, will give his report. It will be followed by presidential remarks by Sri T. Rangarao garu, then address by our Vice President of MJM Memorial Committee and Teacher MLC and MLC, Sri K.S. Lakshman Rao. Then Leela Mohan Rao will be introducing the chief guest, and then the endowment lecture, for which we have been waiting here, by Professor D. Narasimha Reddy garu will be delivered. It will be followed by vote of thanks by Dr. K. Moses. Now I request Sri Chukka Esaratnam garu, Secretary MJM Memorial Committee, to kindly give his report. Over to Esaratnam garu. I request Moses to kindly give the mic to Esaratnam garu.
Good morning, everybody. Today, we are celebrating 12th anniversary of our beloved MJ Manikyarao garu. MJ Manikyarao garu was a versatile teacher. Throughout his life, he worked for the welfare of the teachers. A strong person who believes the well-being of the teachers. Manikyarao garu, he suffered his life even in the underground movement by thinking the well-being of the teachers alone. After his death, all the members of ACTA, the MJM Trust, like Yarlagadda Rajgopal Rao garu, Tummal Rangarao garu, Shankar, S.R.K. Prasad, Allam Satyanarayana, like that several people assembled in the graveyard itself and decided to have a trust on the name of M.J. Manikyarao. And the trust actually it is having T. Rangarao garu as the president and myself, Dr. Chukka Esaratnam as the secretary, Sri S.R.K. Prasad as the treasurer, and several executive committee members like this. Every year, we are conducting one program at a particular town or city. by fixing a memorial lecture. For that memorial lecture, we are inviting the stalwarts in the subject from all over the country. This year, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we could not have a large gathering. That's why we requested the principal of Andhra Christian College to have this Zoom arrangement. Immediately, the principal and the associate principal, they gave their consent and arranged this program with their technicians. We are grateful to Andhra Christian College for this type of arrangement. Later on, the trust, it is giving scholarships to the meritorious students of the respective colleges in that particular area. So MJM committee, it is the permanent committee. It carries its works by following the principles of MJ Manikara Garu. For today's topic, Professor D. Narasimha Reddy Garu, he is coming, and the topic is National Education Policy 2020. For that, previously in 1986, the education policy was there. So many changes are carried in the previous 1986 bill, and now this modern national education policy, it was approved on 29th July 2020. This particular one, the new education policy, though it has its own defects, the main concern is it wants to transform the present education system into an excellent education program by 2040, that is 2040. So many changes. For example, in school education, previously it was between 6 and 14 years. But now it is from 3rd year up to 18 years. So 12 years of schooling is there, of which 3 years are reserved for Anganwadi. Like this, even the degree college level also, it has its own changes. The students get the opportunity of selecting the groups. So as we see in foreign countries, selection of the subject, that is the most important thing for the student. According to his interest and pleasure, he can choose the subject. So this new education policy, though it has several deformities, like privatization mainly, it is very good. Now, our chief guest today, Professor Narasimha Reddy Garu, is going to deliver the complete picture of the National Education Policy 2020. So once again, I thank the principal, associate principal, and the staff of Andhra Christian College for arranging this Zoom program. Thank you.
సార్ అదే నేను 2 మాటలు అనౌన్స్ చేస్తాను సార్. Thank you very much, Sri Chukka S. Ratnam, Secretary MJM Memorial Committee, for your nice words and analysis. Now I welcome Sri T. Rangarao Garu, President MJM Memorial Committee, to tell a few words. Welcome you, sir.
పెట్టండి చేలో పెట్టండి చాలా మంచి చెవులో పెట్టారు పెట్టండి ఓకే Before I commence my remarks, I want to say a few words to remove certain misconceptions about Mr. Manika Rao's philosophy. There was a belief that Mr. Manika Rao eschewed materialism. It was totally wrong. Mr. Manika Rao believed in materialism based on social justice. He, of course, has his own moral code. But that is the problem with me. That's why I was very strongly advised by the technical advisor that I should stick to the script. I should not speak extempore because I don't know where I would end. I may talk nonsense. I may talk something which is most irrelevant. But this is the problem with the topic because I am so closely and spiritually attached to this program. It is very difficult for me to control myself. So I will stick to the script that I have before me. I welcome you all to this webinar and extend special welcome to Professor D. Narasimha Reddy Garu, the chief guest for this year's MJM Memorial Lecture. I make bold to pass some undiplomatic comments on new educational policy 20, hoping that my age gives me a license as we are influenced by the bitter memories in our long academic journey and my close association with ACTA. But my comments, believe me, are not post-truth. Sophistication and theorization often cover up hard facts. So let me venture to open up. The NEP 20 recommends academic freedom, but the field realities are most appealing. I think it was in year 1969 that Andhra University took a most contentious decision to reduce the language component for degree classes. The university invited ACTA and others to participate in exchange of views. The association, led by its then president, Sri Lakshminatha Rao Garu, and our beloved leader, Sri MJM Manika Rao Garu, along with some of us, attended the meeting. The bureaucrat cum vice chancellor, I don't want to name him, delivered a windy speech and callously declared the meeting closed. Sri Lakshminatha Rao Garu, unlike the present principals, I am sorry to mention that, stood up, confronted the vice chancellor, and demanded that our views should be heard, which made the vice chancellor reluctantly. Immediately after the meeting, we took out a big rally from Turner's Chowdhury in Vizag to express our resentment at the authoritarian attitude of the authorities. towards academic matters. This is only an example of the intolerance of rulers to academic freedom. I know for sure that things have further worsened now. For example, the medium of instruction at the elementary level has become a matter for political rather than academic decision. Academic issues are decided through polling booths. I fervently hope that this will not be extended to medicine too. Multidisciplinary education, which was in vogue in ancient India, in place of present super specialization, is aimed at in new NEP 20. Here again, the ground realities are distressing. In some degree colleges, classes are run without even a single teacher in some departments. And I'm afraid the situation is no better in some of the universities also. Contract and part-time lecturers are engaged to bring about semblance of normalcy. In this disturbing situation, the NEP 20 proposed option to students to multiple entry exit system during every academic year. It adds to further complications. The NEP 20 is also optimistic of filling lakhs of teachers' vacancies, imparting training to many lakhs of untrained teachers, earmarking 6% of GDP for education, and opening of preschool institutions. That too, that is the confusion with my age. During the post-pandemic period, the present political scenario is so confusing that one cannot hope to have coordinated efforts by the central and state governments for the successful implementation of the policy. పోయిందమ్మా ఇందాక నుంచి వేస్తారా Deliberate attempts are being made to shrink the size of the state, role of the state in the field of higher education. It is imperative that the state is made answerable for proper functioning of the educational system through appropriate policies. That does not mean that the state should be the big brother in matters like what is to be taught and how it should be taught. Are the policymakers daydreaming? Ultimately, all is not lost, and it can never be. I end my remarks with this optimistic note. Thank you very much.
Now it is over to Leela Mohan Garu to introduce the chief guest.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
I deem it a privilege to introduce to the members of the MJM Memorial Committee, Professor Narasimha Reddy Garu, today's chief guest, who has been invited to deliver MJM Memorial Endowment Lecture. Professor Narasimha Reddy Garu was formerly Professor of Economics at the University of Hyderabad. He served as a Sankaran Chair Professor, National Institute of Rural Development, Hyderabad, and he was also ICSSR National Fellow. He was also a former director of the Academic Staff College, University of Hyderabad. Presently, he is Honorary Visiting Professor, Institute of Human Development, New Delhi. His areas of specialization include labor economics, agrarian studies, and political economy of development. He supervised a large number of students for their MPhil dissertations and PhD thesis. His publications include Agrarian Crisis in India, published by the Oxford University Press in 2009, edited with Srijit Mishra. Another book was Rural Labor Mobility in Times of Structural Transformation, Dynamics and Perspectives from Asian Economies. It was published by Palgrave in 2017, co-edited with K. Saraf. And another famous book is India, Social Development Report 2018, Raising Inequalities in India. It was published by the Oxford University Press in 2019. It was also co-edited with T. Huck. Professor Narasimha Reddy Garu was also the chairman of Andhra Pradesh Economic Association for several years, I think more than a decade. The association under his stewardship discussed various economic issues which had great relevance and importance in the context of economic development, economic reforms, and the inequalities. Professor D. Narasimha Reddy Garu is an expert on agrarian issues. The government has utilized his expertise by nominating him on several expert panels constituted by the Government of India as well as the Government of Andhra Pradesh. To cite a few, he was a member of the Committee on Farmers' Welfare constituted by the Government of Andhra Pradesh in 2004. He was also a member of the expert group on indebtedness of farmers constituted by the Ministry of Finance, Government of India during 2006-07. He served as a member of the Committee on Credit-related Issues under Swarna Jayanti Gram Swarojgar Yojana, constituted by the Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India during 2007-08. He was also a member of the Commission on Inclusive and Sustainable Development of Agriculture in Andhra Pradesh. It was constituted by the Government of Andhra Pradesh in the year 2014-15. Professor Duvuru Narasimha Reddy Garu is a great teacher with exceptional erudition and eloquence. He is loved and held in high esteem by his students and colleagues as well for his simplicity, unassuming conduct, human dignity, and concern for the poor farmers and the labor. His outstanding skills of critical analysis with conviction and ideological commitment wins admiration of one and all. His rich experience in the field of higher education and his concern for the poor and the disadvantaged in terms of equity, affordability, and access are well known. We're very happy that he is now speaking on these concerns in the context of the new educational policy today, hosted by the MJM Memorial Committee. We welcome you, sir. We are very eager to listen to you. Thanks to the organization for giving me this opportunity of introducing a great teacher and a social activist, Professor Narasimha Reddy. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leena Mohan Rao Garu. I only wish I deserved.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you. We just want to take a few minutes of your precious time. I now call upon Dr. Lakshman Rao, sir, Sri K.S. Lakshman Rao, sir, MLC Vice President, to give a few words, to speak few words. Thank you, sir.
ఎక్స్క్యూజ్ మీ సార్, ఈరోజు అధ్యాపక ఉద్యమ నేత ఎంజే మాణిక్యరావు గారి 12వ వర్ధంతి. ఎంజే మాణిక్యరావు గారు మనందరికీ ఆప్తుడైనటువంటి గొప్ప నాయకుడు. ఆయన తన జీవితం మొత్తం ఉపాధ్యాయుల కోసం, అధ్యాపకుల కోసం త్యాగం చేశాడు. అంతేకాదు, ఉన్నత విద్య ప్రభుత్వ రంగంలో ఉండాలి, ఎయిడెడ్ కళాశాలలు, ప్రభుత్వ కళాశాలలు అభివృద్ధి చెందాలని ఆకాంక్షించిన వ్యక్తి. అంతేకాదు, ఈ సమాజంలో ప్రజలందరికీ ఆర్థిక సామాజిక న్యాయం జరగాలని ఆకాంక్షించినటువంటి వ్యక్తి. అలాంటి మహోన్నత వ్యక్తి మరణించి 12 సంవత్సరాలు అయింది. ఆయన పేరుతో MJM మెమోరియల్ కమిటీ, ఎంజే మాణిక్యరావు మెమోరియల్ కమిటీ ఏర్పాటు చేశాం. ఈరోజు 12వ వర్ధంతి సందర్భంగా ప్రొఫెసర్ నరసింహారెడ్డి గారు చాలా గొప్ప వ్యక్తి. ఆయన కూడా సెంట్రల్ యూనివర్సిటీలో ఎకనామిక్స్ డిపార్ట్మెంట్ ప్రొఫెసర్గా వారు పనిచేశారు. చాలాసార్లు ఆయన ఉపన్యాసాలు కూడా వినటం జరిగింది. ఈరోజు ఈ వెబినార్ సందర్భంగా MJM కమిటీ అధ్యక్షులు శ్రీ తుమ్మల రంగారావు గారు ఇక్కడ ఉన్నారు. కార్యదర్శి శ్రీ సుక్కా యేసరత్నం గారు ఉన్నారు. అలాగే MJM కుమారులు విజయ్ కుమార్ గారు, ఆయన భార్య గారు కూడా ఇక్కడ ఉన్నారు. ఏసీ కాలేజ్ ప్రిన్సిపాల్, ఇతర మిత్రులు, డాక్టర్ లీలామోహన్, డాక్టర్ శంకర్, అందరికి కూడా నేను హృదయపూర్వక శుభాకాంక్షలు తెలియజేస్తున్నాను. ప్రధానమైనటువంటి అంశం, కేంద్ర కేబినెట్ 2020 జూలై 29న నూతన విద్యా విధానాన్ని ఆమోదించింది. అది ఇప్పుడు పాలసీ అయిపోయింది. అంతకుముందు 2 ఏళ్ల క్రితం కస్తూరి రంగన్ కమిటీని కేంద్ర ప్రభుత్వం నియమించింది. మానవ వనరుల శాఖ 474 పేజీల రిపోర్టుని కస్తూరి రంగన్ కమిటీ తయారు చేసి దాన్ని కేంద్ర కేబినెట్ 65 పేజీల నూతన విద్యా విధానాన్ని ప్రకటించింది. అది అమలు చేయడానికి ప్రయత్నం చేస్తాం. ఈ సందర్భంగా ఒక 5 నిమిషాలు దీని మీద నా అభిప్రాయం వెల్లడి చేస్తాను. మొదటిది, ఏ విద్యా విధానానికైనా ఒక ఫిలాసఫీ ఉండాలి, ఒక తాత్వికత ఉండాలి. కొఠారి కమిషన్ తన రిపోర్ట్ను సమర్పించినప్పుడు 1966లో దానికి ఒక తాత్వికత ఉంది. ప్రభుత్వ విద్యారంగం కొనసాగాలి అని చెప్పేసి ఆ రోజు కొఠారి కమిషన్ చెప్పింది. వాట్ ఈస్ ద ఫిలాసఫీ ఆఫ్ NEP 2020? నా దృష్టిలో నూతన విద్యా విధానం ప్రభుత్వ రంగానికి ప్రాధాన్యత ఇవ్వాలి అని ఎక్కడా కూడా చెప్పలేదు. ప్రైవేటు రంగం కొనసాగాలి, ప్రైవేటు రంగం నిస్వార్థంగా ఎటువంటి లాభాపేక్ష లేకుండా పనిచేయాలని చెప్పేసి నూతన విద్యా విధానంలో చెప్పారు. ఇప్పుడున్న ప్రపంచీకరణ నేపథ్యంలో ప్రైవేటు రంగం నిస్వార్థంగా పనిచేస్తుందా, లాభాపేక్ష లేకుండా పనిచేస్తుందా? ఇది మనం ప్రశ్నించుకోవాల్సినటువంటి అంశం. రెండోది, భారత రాజ్యాంగం చాలా స్పష్టంగా ఈ దేశ ప్రజలందరికీ ఆర్థిక సామాజిక న్యాయం జరగాలని స్పష్టంగా డాక్టర్ అంబేద్కర్ నాయకత్వాన్ని చెప్పింది. కానీ నూతన విద్యా విధానంలో ఎక్కడా కూడా సామాజిక న్యాయం గురించి ప్రస్తావన చేయలేదు. అందువల్ల ఓవరాల్గా చూసినప్పుడు నూతన విద్యా విధానం యొక్క సారాంశం కూడా ప్రైవేటీకరణ వైపు దారి తీయటమేనా అని అనిపించక మానదు. నా వరకు నాకు అలా అనిపించింది. ఎందుకంటే ఇందులో అంశాలు మనం చూస్తే చాలా ఉన్నాయి, కానీ ఉన్నత విద్యకు సంబంధించిన 3 అంశాలు ప్రస్తావన చేస్తాం. ఒకటి, GER గ్రాస్ ఎన్రోల్మెంట్ రేషియో ప్రస్తుతం 26.5% ఉంది. 2035 నాటికి దీన్ని 50% చేయాలని NEPలో ప్రతిపాదించారు. అంటే ఉన్నత విద్య చదివేవాళ్ళు 50% పెరగాలి. సంతోషం. ఎంత ఎక్కువ మంది చదువుకుంటే అంత మంచిది. కానీ ఈ GER పెరగటానికి ఉన్న మార్గం ఏమిటి? అది ప్రభుత్వ రంగంలో జరుగుద్దా, ప్రైవేట్ రంగంలో జరుగుద్దా? ఇది స్పష్టత లేదు. ఎందుకంటే భారతదేశం ప్రాంతాల మధ్య అసమానతలు ఉన్న దేశం, కులాల మధ్య అసమానతలు ఉన్న దేశం, ఆర్థికంగా అసమానతలు ఉన్న దేశం. మీకు ఒక ఉదాహరణ చెప్తాను. ఇప్పుడు జీఆర్ 26% అన్నారు, కానీ బీహార్లో 13%. బీహార్లో 13%. ఎస్టీ విద్యార్థుల్లో 13%. ఎస్సీ విద్యార్థుల్లో 18%. ఈ అంశాలు మనం పరిగణనలోకి తీసుకోకుండా ఈ దేశంలో పెద్ద పెద్ద విషయాలు మాట్లాడుతూ ఉన్నాం. అందుకని జీఆర్ ఎలా సాధిస్తారు, ఇది నా ప్రశ్న. ఇక రెండో అంశం చాలా ముఖ్యమైనది. గత 60 ఏళ్ళుగా మనం యూజీసీ గురించి వింటున్నాం, యూనివర్సిటీ గ్రాంట్స్ కమిషన్. ఈరోజు కళాశాలలకి, యూనివర్సిటీలకి పెద్ద ఎత్తున గత 60 ఏళ్ళుగా యూజీసీ ఫండ్స్ ఇచ్చింది, లైబ్రరీస్ నిర్మాణం చేసింది, జిమ్నాషియంస్ నిర్మాణం చేసింది. అలాగే ఏఐసిటి గురించి విన్నాం. కానీ నూతన విద్యా విధానం యూజీసీ, ఏఐసిటి ఈ సంస్థలన్నింటినీ రద్దు చేసేసి నేషనల్ ఎడ్యుకేషన్ అథారిటీ అని చెప్పేసి ఒక కొత్త సంస్థను ఏర్పాటు చేస్తారు. నా దృష్టిలో యూజీసీని రద్దు చేయడం అనేది ప్రైవేటీకరణకు దారితీసే అంశం అని చెప్పేసి నేను దృఢంగా భావిస్తా ఉన్నాను. మూడో అంశం, మనకు ప్రస్తుతం ఎఫిలియేటింగ్ విధానం ఉంది, అనుబంధ కళాశాలలు అంటున్నాం. డిగ్రీ కళాశాలలు అన్నీ కూడా యూనివర్సిటీలకు అనుబంధమై ఉన్నాయి. నాగార్జున యూనివర్సిటీకి ఒక 300 కళాశాలలు అనుబంధమై ఉన్నాయి. నూతన విద్యా విధానం ఏం చెప్పిందంటే 2030 నాటికి అనుబంధ కళాశాలలు అనే కాన్సెప్ట్ ఉండకూడదు, నో ఎఫిలియేషన్ సిస్టమ్ తీసేయాలని చెప్పి. నేను దీన్ని కూడా వ్యతిరేకిస్తున్నా. అనుబంధ కళాశాలలు యూనివర్సిటీకి అఫిలియేషన్ లేకపోతే ప్రైవేట్ రంగంలో ఇవాళ 1000 కళాశాలలు వచ్చినాయి. వీటిని ఎవరు కంట్రోల్ చేస్తారు? వీటి అకాడమిక్స్ కానీ, వీటి ఫీజు స్ట్రక్చర్ కానీ ఎవరు కంట్రోల్ చేస్తారు? అందుకని అది కూడా సరైనది కాదని చెప్పేసి నేను భావిస్తా ఉన్నాను. నాలుగో ముఖ్యమైనటువంటి అంశం, బహుళ శాస్త్రాల విద్యాలయాలు, మల్టీ డిసిప్లినరీ యూనివర్సిటీస్ జిల్లా కోడ్ చొప్పున పెట్టాలని చెప్పేసి నూతన విద్యా విధానం ప్రతిపాదించింది. అది మనం హ్యాపీ, జిల్లా కోడ్ అలా పెట్టనివ్వండి. 3000 నుంచి 5000 పిల్లలు అందులో ఉండేలా పెట్టాలని, తక్షశిల, నలంద టైపులో పెట్టాలని హ్యాపీ. కానీ నా ప్రశ్న ఏంటంటే, ఈ బహుళ శాస్త్ర విద్యాలయాలు ప్రైవేట్ రంగంలో పెడతారా, ప్రభుత్వ రంగంలో పెడతారా? ఇది స్పష్టత లేదు. అందువల్ల ఇలాంటి అనేక అంశాలు ఇండియన్ ఎడ్యుకేషన్ కూడా గ్లోబలైజేషన్ చేసి విదేశీ విద్యా సంస్థల్ని ఇండియాలోకి ఇన్వైట్ చేయాలని కూడా ఇందులో ప్రతిపాదించారు. ఈ మొత్తం సారాంశాన్ని చూసినప్పుడు నూతన విద్యా విధానం తర్వాత రాబోయే 10-15 ఏళ్లలో విద్యారంగం మరింత ప్రైవేటీకరణ జరిగే అవకాశం ఉంది, మరింత కార్పొరేటీకరణ జరిగే అవకాశం ఉంది. ఇప్పటికే మన రాష్ట్రంలో చూసాం, 50% ప్రైవేటీకరణ జరిగిపోయింది. 1990లో 450 యూనివర్సిటీలు ఉంటే ఈ రోజున 2020లో భారతదేశంలో 907 యూనివర్సిటీలు ఉన్నాయి. యూనివర్సిటీల సంఖ్య పెరిగింది, కానీ ఈ 907 యూనివర్సిటీల్లో సుమారు 400 యూనివర్సిటీలు ప్రైవేట్ డీమ్డ్ యూనివర్సిటీలు. వాళ్ళు డీమ్డ్ యూనివర్సిటీలు మనం చూస్తున్నాం, అది యూనివర్సిటీయా? ఏమన్నాయి డీమ్డ్ యూనివర్సిటీల్లో? బీటెక్ కోర్స్ తప్పితే ఒక బిఏ ఎకనామిక్స్ కానీ, లేకపోతే ఎంఏ ఎకనామిక్స్ కానీ, ఒక సైకాలజీ కానీ, ఒక సోషియాలజీ కానీ, ఫిజికల్ సైన్సెస్ కానీ, బయలాజికల్ సైన్సెస్ కానీ, సోషల్ సైన్సెస్ కానీ ఏ యూనివర్సిటీలో అయినా ఉన్నాయా డీమ్డ్ యూనివర్సిటీలో? అంటే డీమ్డ్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రైవేట్ యూనివర్సిటీ అంటే వ్యాపారం చేయటమేనా? ఆ యూనివర్సిటీలో రిజర్వేషన్లు ఉన్నాయా? ఈ ప్రశ్నలు ఇవాళ వాటికి సమాధానాలు చెప్పకుండా మనం ఏవేవో మాట్లాడి ఉపయోగం లేదు. ఆంధ్రప్రదేశ్లో ప్రత్యేకించి గత 15-20 ఏళ్లుగా పెద్ద ఎత్తున ప్రైవేటీకరణ జరిగింది. ఆంధ్రప్రదేశ్లో ఇవాళ 140 ఎయిడెడ్ కళాశాలలు ఉంటే గత 15 ఏళ్లుగా అక్కడ రిక్రూట్మెంట్ లేదు. వేలాది మంది అన్ఎయిడెడ్ అధ్యాపకులుగా పనిచేస్తూ ఉన్నారు. ప్రభుత్వ డిగ్రీ కళాశాలలన్నీ కూడా కాంట్రాక్ట్ లెక్చరర్లతో నడుస్తూ ఉన్నాయి. మాణిక్యరావు గారు ఆశించింది ఇది కాదు. అందుకన ఈరోజు నూతన విద్యా విధానం మీద పెద్ద ఎత్తున డిబేట్ జరగాలి, ప్రభుత్వాల మీద ఒత్తిడి తేవాలి, ఇందులో ఉన్న కొన్ని విధానాలు మార్చాలనేది నాకున్నటువంటి అభిప్రాయం. ఇప్పటికే కొన్ని ఆ రకమైనటువంటి ప్రయత్నాలు జరుగుతున్నాయి. ముఖ్యంగా రాష్ట్రాలను ఎటువంటి సంప్రదింపులు కూడా చేయలే కేంద్రం. విద్య అనేది ఉమ్మడి జాబితాలో ఉంది, రాష్ట్రాలను సంప్రదించాలి. అందువల్ల ఈ అంశాలు దృష్టిలో పెట్టుకుని మరి మన రాష్ట్రంలో కూడా జగన్మోహన్ రెడ్డి గారి ప్రభుత్వం ఆయన స్కూళ్ళని స్ట్రెంగ్తన్ చేయడానికి అనేక ప్రయత్నాలు చేస్తున్నారు. మేము అప్రిషియేట్ చేస్తున్నాం. ఆయన అమ్మఒడి కానీ, నాడు నేడు కానీ, విద్యా కానుక కానీ, వీటన్నిటిని మేము జగన్మోహన్ రెడ్డి గారిని అప్రిషియేట్ చేశాం. ఆయన గవర్నమెంట్ స్కూళ్ళని స్ట్రెంగ్తన్ చేయడానికి ప్రయత్నం చేస్తున్నారు. వి అప్రిషియేట్ హిమ్. బట్ అట్ ద సేమ్ టైం కాలేజ్ అండ్ యూనివర్సిటీ ఎడ్యుకేషన్ మీద ప్రభుత్వం ఇంకా దృష్టి పెట్టలేదు. ఎయిడెడ్ కళాశాలల్ని రాష్ట్రంలో పెద్ద ఎత్తున ప్రైవేటీకరించాలనే ప్రయత్నం జరుగుతాం. ఇప్పటికే విజయనగరంలో అలాంటి ప్రయత్నం ప్రారంభమైంది. దీన్ని మేము వ్యతిరేకిస్తున్నాం. అందువల్ల ఈ రాష్ట్రంలో కూడా ఎయిడెడ్ కాలేజీలు, ప్రభుత్వ కళాశాలలు, ప్రభుత్వ యూనివర్సిటీలు బతకాలి, పేద విద్యార్థులు చదువుకోవాలి. దాని ద్వారా మాత్రమే జీఆర్ పెరుగుతుందని చెప్పేసి భావిస్తూ మాణిక్యరావు గారి ఆశయం పబ్లిక్ ఎడ్యుకేషన్ స్ట్రాంగ్గా ఉండటం. వారి ఆశయానికి ఈరోజు గ్లోబలైజేషన్ నేపథ్యంలో కొంత విఘాతం ఏర్పడినప్పటికీ కూడా ఈ దేశం పేదవాళ్ళ దేశం. పేద విద్యార్థులు చదువుకోవాలంటే పబ్లిక్ ఎడ్యుకేషన్ ఇన్స్టిట్యూషన్స్ కొనసాగాలి, ప్రభుత్వం వాటిని ప్రోత్సహించాలని చెప్పేసి భావిస్తూ ఆ రకమైన కృషి మన యూనియన్స్ కానీ, మేము ఎమ్మెల్సీలుగా కానీ చేస్తామని తెలియజేస్తూ ఎంజేఎం మాణిక్యరావు గారికి నేను మరోసారి జోహార్లు అర్పిస్తూ ఎంజేఎం కమిటీకి అభినందనలు తెలియజేస్తూ సెలవు తీసుకు. జై హింద్.
థ్యాంక్ యూ వెరీ మచ్ సార్. చాలా బాగా క్లియర్గా అందరికి అర్థమయ్యే విధంగా మీ అభిప్రాయాన్ని వ్యక్తం చేశారు. సార్కి ఈ టైం చాలదు. మరొకసారి నేను ఖచ్చితంగా మా కాలేజ్ స్టాఫ్ని అడ్రస్ చేయడానికి, మా స్టూడెంట్స్ని అడ్రస్ చేయడానికి, ఇందులో డ్రాబ్యాక్స్ తెలుసుకోవడానికి తప్పకుండా నేను లక్ష్మణరావు సార్ని పిలుస్తాను ఒక లెక్చర్కి. థ్యాంక్ యూ వెరీ మచ్ సార్. నౌ ఐ కాల్ అపాన్ అవర్ Chief guest, Professor D. Narasimha Reddy garu, to give his lecture. We are already late by 10 minutes.
Thank you, madam. Mr. President, members of the MJM committee, family members of MJM Manikirao, and other distinguished participants in this webinar. I am grateful to you for inviting me to give this lecture. Though in all humility, I must accept that I do not measure up to my predecessors who have given these lectures. I still accept this as an honor that has been conferred on me. I am particularly thankful to Dr. Leela Mohan Rao Garu for his introduction and also his persuasion to be here to give this lecture. I personally do not know Manikirao Garu, but I heard a great deal about him because I was also dabbling in teachers movement. I was secretary of the SV University Teachers Association. And later, when I came to Hyderabad, I heard several occasions where we discussed about the contribution of Manikirao, particularly through Professor V. Ramakrishna, who was earlier principal of Kavali College, who was also greatly associated with Manikirao. And then there were several occasions on issues relating to that of teachers in general, particularly college teachers, brought the discussion about his activities. I am, as perhaps expressed by both President Rangarao Garu and MLC Lakshman Rao Garu. Yes, I think I also belong to a tribe where there is some commitment to the cause of public education. I mean, as you perhaps by now know, after listening to Lakshman Rao Garu particularly, it's quite easy to believe that the topic on which we am supposed to talk is too familiar. And therefore, there is a danger that I would be repeating some of the things which he has excellently summed up, talking about the so-called New Education Policy 2020. But what I do is the theme, in spite of all that, is so critical for the future of this country that we require to go into deeper debate, vivisecting what they have, what they have been calling as, let's say, the new economic policy. In fact, the debate started with the document submitted by the committee headed by Kasturi Rangan, which I think, as Lakshman mentioned, is a very forbidding document, 484 pages. Many people perhaps would have glanced through here and there, otherwise didn't perhaps go through in detail. But that was the basis. But I think that what is interesting is looking at that draft and looking at the present, very interesting transformations. I'll come to that. But what I do is, with the limited time, and of course the madam was reminding me I'm starting 10 minutes late. I don't want to hold you up, but let's see, I just would like to put some kind of a contextualization of the discussion on education policy. For that, I will have, let's say, three things to say, or three questions. First, it is better to start with that of understanding the context, which many of us perhaps are familiar. Particularly, there is a question, what is the state of higher education in India as it evolved during the last 3 decades, in terms of its growth, which perhaps is seen in terms of GERs, or in terms of access, equity, as well as, more importantly, equally importantly, quality. The second question is, given the state of higher education into which we have run into, what is the capability of, or the intentions of, the present so-called New Education Policy 2020 in addressing these challenges? And then, of course, the third question with which I close is that the direction in which perhaps the new policy takes us, how far it could bring in equity, inclusion, and social justice. I'll close with that. And therefore, I think in discussing any social and economic dimension, I must, let me say boldly, of any country in the world, more particularly in countries which are supposed to be emerging economies like India, during the last 3 decades, it would be impossible to discuss these issues without referring to that of the regime into which we have come in, that is neoliberal regime. You may talk in terms of globalization. I mean, this is a broad context. I mean, in answering these 3 questions or running through them, one running theme is that the theme that is given to me. What has been the role of the state, particularly in the education sector, over the last 3 decades, in terms of, let's say, improving access, improving equity, improving, let's say, quality. So what I do is first I would quickly run through the issues relating to that of the state of higher education in terms of these 3 issues. I mean, that's it. we can think in terms of, let's say, access, growth in higher education institutions for the particular group, which we refer to as the eligible group of people in the age group of 18 to 23 or 21. Normally, we refer to this as, let's say, gross enrollment rates. If you look at this, it's very difficult to say that there has not been growth. I mean, this like any other growth, like even GDP, we do accept there has been enormous growth after 90s. The same thing holds for higher education as well. For instance, if we start with that of way back in 1951, the gross enrollment rates for higher education for that group of 21, 18, 23, it was hardly 1%. It's actually 0.7%. We have traveled a great deal from there. I mean, that from that by, let me skip all that, 2008, it's also in a sense a landmark break. By 2008, it has become 11%. I mean, that's for, and when we refer to that of in terms of, let's say, colleges and the kind of, let's say, enrollments in colleges, which was in 1950s about 600 to 700 colleges with 1 lakh students. I mean, it looks very small, very meager in 50s. The college going itself is so small. But there was a huge jump. I mean, there were by 2008, it is almost, let's say, 21,000 colleges with about, let's say, almost 120 lakh students. This is a huge jump. But I think from there, I think it was substantially, if you up to at least 90, substantially, the state was very strongly behind that. And then, in fact, the promotion of, let's say, higher education was, nobody thought it would be anybody else's domain than that of, let's say, state. But I think things started moving. This is exactly where I refer to that, the need to remember when we talk in terms of anything after late 80s and 90s, it's very difficult to talk in terms of without referring to that of, let's say, neoliberal regime that was just unfolding. And therefore, you would find that by 2000, within 10 years, I mean, you would see that 2008 to that of 2018, the enrollment rates, I mean, that's the figure, I mean, even Lakshman Rao was referring to that, that's available because the survey of higher education, which should have come this year, it has not come yet, but like many other things which have not come. It shows by 2018, the gross enrollment rates increased from 11% in 2008 to that of, let's say, 26, we can round it to 26%. It's a huge, huge, substantial kind of almost threefold increase, almost, I mean, not increase in a matter of, let's say, just 10 years. And of course, this makes us to turn around and ask as to what happened. I mean, how is it possible? Has the state become very proactive in trying to promote higher education? This is the problem. Let's see, at some point by 1990, they gave up the idea that public education is a domain of, let's say, education, even higher education is a public domain. But that idea was shattered by the penetration of neoliberal kind of, let's say, policies. For instance, if that's, I think 2008 I refer to because the 11th plan is a break point, because for the first time it was the 9th plan which was started opening up higher education. That is in 1990s. That's the beginning of neoliberal regime. They started thinking in terms of, let's say, expanding or opening up higher education to that of private sector. And then the role of private provision of public education. this is a very strange kind of way of neoliberalism pushes it. It thinks that public education could be promoted by private agencies. And the government facilitated this as a part of the plan. And in fact, by the time it is 10th plan, that's 2002, there is a privatization as a preferred strategy. You see, the plan itself mentions that higher education in the private domain is the preferred strategy. And then they also set by 11th plan, that is, I think by 2008, targets were fixed, because I refer to that of 8 to that of 18, almost 3 times increase in enrollment. It is largely because this particular 11th plan trying to emphasize that enrollment should increase by 2020 to 30%. It has happened, of course. But how did it happen? Within this period, you would find there is, I think, when we refer to that, there are about at the beginning of, let's say, this period, there were about 98 private universities already. And then when it comes to the 17 deemed universities, about 8,000, let's say, private colleges. And then, of course, there are also other varieties of private institutions giving diplomas, about 4,000. The result is that much of the expansion happened in private sector, but the private sector has expanded largely for private profit. It's not in fact, when it comes to the question of the present 2020, there is a ad nauseum repetition of private, what they call as philanthropic institutions. All that we have known as philanthropic, we know now stands totally destroyed. I mean, there is a mention how some of the best aided private colleges are being systematically destroyed by not filling, let's say, the sanction vacancies and putting them into the mercy of, let's say, raising their own resources. Well, anyway, this expansion, when it comes to the question of, let's say, this was seriously criticized widely. And therefore, what happened was in the 11th plan, they started talking in terms of increasing allocation to that of education by 9 times. This was the part of, let's say, proposal, but it never happened. Even the allocated money was not completely spent on higher education. Only 46% was spent. And therefore, the whole scenario was that there is extensive privatization. And in fact, I just quickly run through this. The very interesting logic, I mean, many of us, I think I see many of my generation across, and therefore we are part of this story, because the cogent logic was built up in 1990s, saying that to promote privatization of higher education, with the launching of the neoliberal reforms, the argument was made suggesting higher education is a non-merit good that need not be funded by the state, that the expansion of higher education is to reach about 30% by 2020. It would require enormous financial resources, which cannot be met by the state, and hence the need for private investment, including foreign direct investment in higher education. Interestingly, this was the time we were talking about WTO and higher education. The Commerce Ministry argued that the higher education sector in India should be freed, and the country should open its doors for foreign investment, promoting the government of India to approve 100% automatic foreign direct investment in higher education. That was, I think, the proposal in 2000. But of course, not many foreign industries in universities are dying, or let's say, to come down here because they need more money if you have to. And then, of course, the entire government resource constraint hardly refers to strategies of high growth. And then there is a persistent of low tax GDP. This was also deliberately done, and a huge potential to raise taxes, both direct and, of course, to an extent indirect, were constrained. They were extensive. Lakhs of concessions were given to that of, let's say, corporate sector, showing At any point of time, your tax GDP would remain only at 11%, 12%. It will not cross, let's say, 16%. If concessions were not given to the extent of 5-6 lakhs, even in early 2000s, we would have crossed 17 to 18% tax GDP ratio, but that never happened. And in fact, the contrast is all of us are very familiar with this. And then when it comes to the question of the only lip sympathy to that of the 6%, even that happens in the 2020 policy, the additional revenue mobilization option in the light of growing potential tax base has been kept in cold storage. They never bothered to put effort in raising revenues by way of resources for the state. Instead, they have given up government in higher education, in expansion, and then invited, this is also very familiar, corporate heads like Mukesh Ambani, Kumar Mangalam, and then of course Narayana Murthy, head committees to decide the future higher education of the country. And interestingly, business and industrial organizations like Asokim, FICCI have been busy conducting summits of higher education as to how to convert them as opportunities for making more money. This is the state in which the whole higher education was left. The consequence is visible in terms of what could be referred to as, let's say, although this is where we are saying that if new education policy says that you have to increase enrollment rates, GER, to that of 50% by 2035, it's possible. It's already 30% plus. But the question is, what type of enrollment, for whom and how? This is where the question of equity comes in. You are enrolling people, that how and where. In fact, okay, a little bit of this before I move on to the, see, when it referred to that of this expansion of privatization during 2008 onwards, you see that there is, I think, by 2018, the proportion of colleges privately managed were 80% of the total colleges in the country, of which 65% are private unaided for-profit colleges, only about 13.5% aided colleges. And I think the kind of, let's say, expansion is already there is a mention for Andhra Pradesh, which is on the ahead. 88% of expansion, 88% of expansion was private unaided. If it comes to engineering colleges, maybe it's 95%. In Tamil Nadu, it's about, let's say, 87%. And 8 states with the highest number then account for almost, let's say, these are the states including that of the Tamil Nadu, combined Andhra Pradesh. Even states like Rajasthan, Gujarat, MP also expanded. Therefore, the result is that you have numbers. It's some kind of a massification. I say this because if you raise questions of equity and questions of quality, what exactly was happening, there is a great deal of instead of injustice done to that of, let's say, that young community which is drawn into these shops, which are perhaps, I mean, there are a range of things. The private institutions also, there are a range in the sense, as I was telling, there are colleges without a lecturer, classes without subject lecturers, and this has happened. And then when it comes to the question of equity, we can look at different dimensions. Like, for instance, one could think in terms of as to what is happening to regional, as already mentioned, is made of, let's say, it's not true that every state is happening, because no, even to start private business of higher college education, you need, let's say, money in the state. Therefore, the example of Bihar, it's a poor state. It's essentially a rural state. Even now, it's 85% of rural, your Bihar population is rural, and therefore there are not much of private college expansion. And there is the enrollment is also 13%. Whereas, of course, it's a lucrative state like Punjab, you would see that 43% is the enrollment rate in Punjab. And then, of course, Andhra Pradesh, 31%, even in UP, it could be 25%. Therefore, you see a range of the shops going for places where there is resources to be taken. This is a very interesting dimension. In fact, I came across a discussion with the Kerala Higher Education Council. One of the interesting things about the council is doing is it's some kind of a what we call as emphasis on justice. They said that they would prioritize funding the remotest colleges and the least reputed colleges so that they could be built up to the level of other colleges. But here, I think, when it comes to the private enterprise, it's quite obvious. The regional pattern is quite obvious because where there is money, you go there to start college. And they say that's a, one can perhaps our own students can run, let's say, regressions as to the state per capita income and then the increase in, let's say, the rate of private institutions in higher education. And of course, the same thing is true that when it comes to the question of rural urban, of course, this is a background. These surveys are based on rural background students. The enrollments are relatively less. And therefore, if you take into consideration of gender, naturally, we all know that women lag behind. But all these things are changing in a sense. And then, of course, more important when it comes to the question of equity, we do talk in terms of social dimension of communities, particularly disadvantaged communities and their enrollment. In fact, there is no data except one community because the UGC surveys just talk of only scheduled castes, but they don't give other communities as ratios. But there has been an increase. This is, I think, where it adds up. When it comes to the question of 2011-12, the overall enrollment rate was 21%. The scheduled caste enrollment was 15%. When the enrollment rate overall increased to 26, the scheduled caste enrollment also increased 23. This is, I think, the one dimension. Where are they going? And then let's say, if they're increasing enrollment, is there an improvement in their condition of, let's say, capabilities to earn better livelihood through that of better employment? I mean, that question could wait for some time. When it comes to the question of data relating to that, one is a caste dimension. We do have the sources, of course, the NSS surveys. The 71st survey of 2014 is the last survey. They made 75th survey. They have not released data. This is one of the interesting dimensions of the present regime. They have any inconvenient data, they will not release. The 75th round of NSS data on consumption expenditure has not been released. But if we go by 2014 and see as to what happens, there is a class, there is a caste dimension. In fact, when it refers to that of enrollment rate of, this is, I think, Lakshmana already mentioned. See that when it's ST, it's about 15%, SC about 21%, and then others 40%. And of course, BC 28. This continues. But what is interesting is we have data for different income groups for 2014. It runs through. This is the deeper. We talk in terms of not only caste, but within the caste, the class matters. If you refer to that of even scheduled tribes, there is information on 1821 dropout rates in scheduled castes, scheduled castes in other communities. If you look at, let's say, the 4 income groups, the poorest, lowest, second lowest, third, and the highest. If you take into consideration scheduled tribes, the poorest class, the 4th bottom, poorest class, 85% dropout. They just go and then perhaps could not continue their education. But whereas among them, the top 25% of people, there is a dropout rate drops steeply into that of 18%. It is true for all. For instance, even in the case of, let's say, so-called the others or so-called forward communities, the poorest 73% is dropouts. And of course, when you come to that, the top group, it's only 25% dropout. Therefore, unless you address this problem of, let's say, I mean, this is a part of the story of neoliberalism. When it comes to the question of what is happening, this is exactly where you refer to that of what is happening to whole of growth of GDP and how it is distributed. It's not only, I mean, of course, I will complete this dimension when we refer to that of caste and class. There is no doubt that the hierarchy of caste as we see ST, SC, BC, and then FC, there is within that, I'm saying that there is a class differences, but there is no gainsaying there are no differences. There are differences across the caste, but within the caste, there are, let's say, differences, rich, poor. But of course, what is to be remembered is the poor proportion among the so-called forward communities is much smaller. And therefore, if I say that 70%, 73% of the poorest of the rich are dropping out, it is only the poorest among the so-called forward communities is only about, let's say, less than 20%. Whereas when it comes to the question of the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, the poorest are more than 50%. And therefore, 80% or 50% is much, much larger. Well, these are interesting dimensions, and these cleavages are growing. Now, if the differences at one, if you refer to that for the map, what is happening in scheduled caste enrollment, it is increasing. But what happens within that, there are several who are left behind. And then, of course, in other cases also, why this has happened, it's essentially, instead of closing gap in their capacity to earn and, let's say, live better, what has done, neoliberalism has done is increase the disparities. To give an example, this is a hard data that we have now. We have summary of what could be called as the share of different groups. We can say the top 10% of all the population in the country, and then next 40%, you may call them loosely middle class, and then the bottom, let's say 50%. If you take this, the top 10%, the total earnings generated, I mean, in terms of GDP, total generated between 51, 80, 30 years, the share of the top 10% was 24%. And then the middle 40%, the middle class 49%, the bottom 50% was 28%. But come neoliberal regime, if you take into consideration 1980 to that of, let's say, 2014, this data shows the top income generated, national income generated during this period of 34 years, the top 10% has amassed 66% of the total national income, whereas the middle 40% got only 23%, the bottom 50% had only 11%. I mean, if you, on the one hand, show high growth rates, and when it comes to the question of the other distribution of it, increasingly it's moving up, the shares of the top, and therefore it reflects in this. And then the danger is, it is whichever class is moving up, let's say this top, for them, public higher education institution is no, in fact, is no domain. And on the other hand, is the domain which invites criticism. They say that you can't afford quality education because you have to pay for it. This is the argument. That's how entire neoliberalism has been strengthened in this country. And in fact, since of course there will not be much time, I'll go quickly to that of, let's say, what could be referred to as the quality dimension. I mean, that when it comes to the question of quality, the huge number of studies. And in fact, one way is to look at quality in terms of the rest of the world, in terms of what higher education institutions are doing. And then, or you could look at, let's say, within the country as to who are getting employed. In fact, if you look closely, I don't have time, and look into that of, let's say, even UGC's annual higher education surveys. If you look at, let's say, enrollments and look at, let's say, I said all castes are not given. If you look at scheduled castes for which data is available, most of them end up into that of BA, BCom, BSc, much of the liberal education. And then we'll come to see what is happening to them there. Let's say you have, for accounting purposes, they are all in higher education. Enrollments rates have gone up. But I think what exactly is happening to them, at least if you refer to internationally, you could think in terms of, for instance, one way of looking at is the one which the new education policy wants to promote. They want to make many universities as research universities. But what is the present state? Researchers per million population. And this is about 2018. In the United States, UK, to an extent, Europe, is something like 4,000 to 4,500 per million population. Those who can be called as researchers. And then if we refer to that of, let's say, even China, it's about 1,100. If you refer to that of India, it is 200. Then you see that 4,500 to 200. And then, of course, it also reflects on the kind of, let's say, there is a reference to that of this data is also 2018 data or present regime. It's an interesting data. How quality is affected is through that of, let's say, what is happening in the classrooms. In the central universities, out of the 31,000, this is 2018, out of 31,015 posts, there are 10,567 vacancies. 33% in central universities are vacancies. And then, of course, if you refer to that of, let's say, the category-wise, 35% of professors' posts, 46% of associate professors' posts, 26%. See that you keep, even in central universities, which are supposed to be reasonably better. And then, of course, I don't want to, you all know what's happening to that of, let's say, other universities. And then we turn to that of employability. At least some systematic data we have from 2014, which is brought out in the name of National Skill Reports. And if you take into consideration the skill reports, the employability of, this is of course a larger average figure of those who are qualified graduate and above, is just about 30% for males, 42% for females. And of course, at that time, female enrollment was relatively low. Now, of course, they are on par with males, 42%. That means, and this is, I think this tells more interesting story, which can be linked to the nature of enrollments to different people, poor, socially disadvantaged. It comes that, for instance, over a period, if we get these reports from 2014 regularly up to 2019, there is some improvement by 19 to that of 45% from about 34% employability. But I think when it comes to the question of what type of qualifications are employable. For instance, if you take into consideration arts, BAs, it's only 30%. If you refer to BCom, it's only 30%. And in fact, when it comes to the question of what is surprising, even polytechnic qualified people are also 18%. I mean, these are the areas into which most of the people who are enrolled from poor backgrounds or socially disadvantaged backgrounds get in. And then, of course, you end up without any possibility of entering into that productive employment activities, what little perhaps that's growing. And therefore, when it comes to the question of the situation, I think I can sum up the state of higher education as it evolved during the last 30 years has moved enormously towards that of privatization, which also coincides that the state has starved higher education. This has started from the earlier regime. It is continuing. Instead of, I mean, one thing is that you think in terms of improving it, you can't do that. But much of it is largely due to that of indiscriminate expansion and poor quality of, let's say, higher education provided to through these institutions, private for-profit institutions. And therefore, the second question is the question about the national employment, national education policy. The question is that, is this policy ready to, how do you prepare a policy after 34 years? You have earned all this. These are facts available to the government. You have to correct, change the direction, improve quality, improve, let's say, it's not merely access, quality and equity. How do you do it? Whether the present new educational policy 2020 is capable of that. And we will have a quick look at, let's say, already is so familiar that many people, particularly Lakshman Rao, summarized it. And then, of course, what is interesting is there was a draft which took almost 2 years, 17 to that of 19. Kasturirangan spent a lot of time and produced a heavy 494 document. That's the basis, and therefore there are notes given by the Ministry of Higher Education. And then when it comes to the question of other, let's say, inputs, debate, see, because the Minister for Higher Education in November, when the Parliament met, said they received 2 lakh responses commenting on the draft national education policy of Kasturirangan. And he also claimed this is the world's largest comments received on any policy proposal made anywhere in the world. So you show that is done. And in fact, why it is, I mean, then he also mentioned in the Parliament, it is being, the comments of the states are being expected, and he didn't get it by November. He was saying secretaries are interacting, maybe ministers are interacting, but not much is said what states said. We don't have any information as to what states have commented. And then, of course, in a rush, this seems to be, you have spent 2 years in a draft, and then there is time you have to get a draft, and you have made a draft, discuss it in Parliament. No, you choose a time of a time when there is no Parliament in session and push it through. There are several dimensions to this, because many of the things are pushed this way. There is no real debate happens in Parliament. And then, of course, if you have so comments, there must be some way of, let's say, looking at these comments and discussing it. No, it was not done. Anyway, the NEP 2020, what it does, of course, it says to begin with, India, the first point it makes is a country of, is going to be continuously for another decade the country of the youngest population. True, this is where we expect a great deal of what is referred to as demographic dividend. If there's a rich source of manpower, which is likely to be available for next 30, 40 years. And if this manpower, and of course the Prime Minister was talking about Industrial Revolution 4, it requires great challenging kind of, let's say, skills, capabilities, cognitive input, capable of improving cognitive skills. All this he said, but are we providing these things or moving from the state which we have seen, very poor quality, which has expanded? I mean, these are the questions which we expect. And then they also quote the SDG, the so-called Sustainable Development Goal 4. That's some kind of everything you quote wherever it is, perhaps, where you say ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities. So introduction is interesting, yeah. And the aim is by 2040, this is, I think, see, there are also aims after looking at what has happened during the last 30 years. Here is a document which says within 2040 is only 20 years. You have done a lot of damage in 30 years. And what is it that it aims? It says the aim to have an education system by 2040 that is second to none in the world. So, okay. I mean, this is exactly where looking at these things, one is forced to comment. If you look at, let's say, other substance, this particular document, I may do this some kind of a anticipation of what comes through. This is high on rhetoric, very, very deceptive in content. They talk in terms of great things. This document talks in terms of higher education as a public domain. This document talks in terms of 6% minimum investment to be made in higher education. But when you go deeper into that of, let's say, what perhaps this document says, there is, I think, even by moving from the draft to this, there is a great deal of course, neoliberal regime entered in the earlier government, maybe what is called the UPA government. It was, of course, market orientation. But what this government is doing is aggressively promote this direction of neoliberalism, market orientation, or privatization, but add its own, let's say, ideology. Look at this, but a simple thing like what draft Kasturirangan did was, he begins with that of the Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, he talks in terms of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then, of course, talks in terms of education shall be directed towards full development of human personality and strengthening of the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is removed. The draft talks in terms of these high values. And in fact, what this document says is, it systematically, very carefully says constitutional values must be upheld. Very good. But it doesn't mention secularism anywhere. And then it goes on to say that here is a Kasturirangan who is talking about fundamental freedoms, which is essentially the basis for our fundamental rights of the Constitution. Even as talking about constitutional values, the 2020 document doesn't talk about fundamental rights. It talks in terms of, strangely, which the Constitution does, it talks in terms of fundamental duties. And you see, you have tampered already. I mean, you have expressed your intention of the direction in which you are going. And then, of course, there is a great deal of eulogizing of, let's say, the private sector. I mean, that we'll come to that. So therefore, you know, the And in fact, when it comes to, again, Kasturi Rangan, he talks in terms of education in India was only enriched through a mixing of cultures that arose from every first invasion. That's it's a composite culture, multicultural society. Kasturi Rangan talks about it. And what you are doing, you drop that. You talk in terms of rooted in Indian. Of course, it has to be rooted in Indian ethos. And of course, then of course, it contributes to contribute to directly to transformation of India. And of course, it also calls India, that is Bharat. Okay, you say that. And it just brushes aside and goes on to talk of duties, and then of course the question of constitutional values eliminated. They don't seem to recognize 42nd Amendment. I mean, these are disturbing elements, and occasionally we're trying to say that the document would perhaps bring in transformation through the changes. The changes can be summed up. I mean, this is the one which most of the teachers are concerned, because they have put in very high sounding kind of things. I would sum it up into 4 broad things. All these things could be seen as some kind of a structural changes. The first structural change that could be seen is in terms of, that's in section 10 of the report, which says the institutional restructuring. This is some obsessive kind of an institutional restructuring, because we see all this is one directional. They talk in terms of larger multi-disciplinary institutions. That is, I think, they also say that fragmentation should go. I mean, you see, it's a high sounding, good rhetoric. Yes, fragmentation is bad. You must have a multi-disciplinary kind of institutions. It's good, but the way in which it is done, then you have a classification of the universities. You will have this in restructuring of institutions. They aim at, let's say, making everything large. I'll come to that. And when it comes to the question of the types, there will be research intensive universities. And the second category, teaching intensive university. The third category, autonomous higher education institutions. You may call them autonomous colleges, but they are autonomous degree giving colleges. And then when it comes to the question of the targets, by 2030, each district will have one large, what may be referred to as multidisciplinary institution. By 2040, that also would become large multidisciplinary, part of the large multi. That means the target is by 2040, all institutions will be multidisciplinary and large. Universities, research universities, teaching universities, and autonomous colleges. Autonomy, it looks like we also fought for autonomy of all kinds. And then it talks in terms of autonomy as how these institutions will be governed by, including all these institutions. What kind of autonomy? There will be governing board. There is no mention who appoints into the governing board. And then in fact, these governing boards would not only decide, they call it teachers' salaries, they would also regulate, perhaps that's not explicit, they would take control of, let's say, the entire decision-making process. But there is no mention of those who get into that. Not necessarily those from education. It could be anyone, perhaps from the business and other communities. That's the autonomy. And the second restructuring, second important dimension that it talks about is the core structure framework restructuring. It emphasizes the holistic, multidisciplinary thing. This is where I think you talk in terms of introducing, this is most controversial kind of a thing that they bring in. Of course, this is also from the draft of Kasturi Rangan. He talks in terms of two streams of undergraduation. One is, of course, 3-year degree and another is 4-year degree. 3-year degree will not have any research emphasis. The 4-year degree will have 1 year focused on research, kind of, let's say, teaching and learning. When it comes to the question, the worst part of it, it talks in terms of exits, flexibility. See, on the one hand, you are talking in terms of hitting the first structural thing, fragmentation should go. But in the second, when it comes to the question of courses offered, you talk of flexibility. The worst part is if you spend 1 year, you get a certificate. 2 years, you get a diploma. 3 years, you have a past bachelor's degree. And of course, you spend 4 years with a research, 1 year, you get, let's say, the 4-year degree. See, this kind of an exit, what you mean is it's very easy to get 50% enrollment. Who are the ones who would perhaps get out of these institutions after 1 year with a certificate? You just want to dispense. This is, I think, what Prabhat Patnaik is calling it as it is something like promotion of dropouts. Already we are talking about quality and other problems. And then sense of insecurity, it would lead to that of a situation they would just quit 1 year. And what will be the certificate doing? What kind of learning quality? See, this is, I think, completely destroying, in the name of higher education, the potential human capital that is likely to be entering into that of higher education without acquiring any capabilities. It's much easier. 1 year university certificate, and then what perhaps, it also says you can enter later. I don't know when, in what capacity. And then, of course, the pedagogic structure, and this is, I think, where they talk in terms of, this is a familiar jargon, you talk in terms of choice-based credit system. They talk in terms of National Bank of Credit. You can earn credit, and then, of course, deposit that credit in this bank, and then add on from different disciplines. And therefore, it only talks in terms of the possibility of multidisciplinary acquisition of knowledge. And in fact, you are, of course, not one-dimensional. You would become multidimensional. But of course, if you are allowed to quit after 1 year, I don't know what is that dimension. And it also adds open distance learning in this category, and also online courses. You see, all this is combined into what is called as, let's say, the total enrollments in higher education. In fact, as of now, when we talk of 26-30% enrollment, 10% is already open distance learning. The rest, of course, is direct learning. This is, I think, also aimed at promoting what may be referred to as the kind of distance education as a component, which is, I think, much easier. All through, when the basic question is already raised, who would be part of this expansion? There is nowhere any mention of the state as the provider of improved or increasing higher education. In fact, repeatedly, there is a mention of what is called as the, they categorize private philanthropic efforts on equal footing. And then you give such a role to private philanthropic role, and then anything could be called as, let's say, philanthropic. And then they talk in terms of the last part is the structure of regulation. This is what is called as a regulated system. Before that, let me briefly refer to, there is a chapter which emphasizes what we are interested more in the name of equity and inclusion. See, this is a very strange way of, let's say, talking about equity. It doesn't say much because it catalogs a very long list of things in the name of equity. See, for instance, I don't know what we understand as equity. it simply says earmark suitable government funds for education of, they have a category called SEDGs. There is a creation, and it looks like all of us forget scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, or other backward communities. The nomenclature is socio-economically disadvantaged groups. This is the nomenclature is extensively used in the report. And I think nowhere it talks in terms of any affirmative action, no question of reservations. Of course, we have our own state chief minister already this year, 6 private universities. It simply says that there are no reservations there. And in fact, you can see what this policy, nowhere there's a possibility. It merely says government will suitably fund what is called as education. They don't, I mean, when it comes to the question of, let's say, the role, more financial assistance and scholarships of SDGs, both in public and private higher education institutions. How private higher education institutions would give scholarships? Most of them are there to collect money. And who is going to give these scholarships? And then if they have to give scholarships, what type of fees that they should collect, from whom? And it's a very interesting. And therefore, you know, they have 2 groups of action under equity. This is, I think, very casually. It says steps to be taken by government. There are about 8 steps, A, B, C, D, F, and of which this is the higher education. Of course, they say in backward districts, what they call as aspirational districts, there will be university location. You locate universities in aspiration districts, government locates it, or let's say the private institutions. And how you are going to provide resources for these institutions, how you attract people without support systems like reservations and scholarships. And then there are steps for higher education institutions. And then it says financial assistance and scholarships will be provided. And then there is no mention of, let's say, what amount and what, I mean, that's see now, of course, we have a clear cut what is called post-merit scholarships for groups like SC, SC, and then of course minorities. And in the entire report, when they talk in terms of objectives, there is nowhere a mention of a word called minority. And this new nomenclature, social and economically, social and economically disadvantaged groups, they're not causal. And then when it comes to the question of regulation, it is a very, again, extremely centralized national commission for education. Of course, Kasturi Rangan recommended this National Commission on Education should be headed by the Prime Minister, but it's a very odd thing. But the NEP 2020 says this commission would be headed by the Education Minister and Union Education Minister. It will have 4 what it refers to as 4 verticals for the regulation of institutions. This is exactly a very strange expression which has become very popular. This regulation will be light but tight. That means you introduce private institution expansion, and then you say that regulation would be light but tight. What does it mean that light? You give, it also talks of all licenses, restrictions would go. They would become autonomous by, let's say, 2035. And by 40, of course, everybody would say that they are part of the larger institutional system. But how can you say that it will perhaps regulate This is a critical thing is, if you open up every proposition, it's a part of neoliberalism. What they are calling is the entire system would become self-regulating. The system would increasingly become private, and the private become self-regulating. Therefore, you are, let's say, the government would be, let's say, just sitting there to, let's say, supervise or, let's say, promote this kind of a system. And then, of course, the four letters, they do mention what may be referred to as the kind of institutions that perhaps for instance, for the purpose of, let's say, regulation, they call it as National Higher Education Regulatory Council. It will function common as a single point regulator. And the second, when it comes to the question of funding, there would be Higher Education Grants Council. I don't know how it would be shadow of your University Grants Commission. And the third is that, of course, the accreditability, National Accreditation Council. The fourth is that of, let's say, General Education Council, which is expected to monitor the learning outcomes. This is some kind of assessment. And then the entire thing is centralized. There is no mention of any role to that of the state. And this brings me down to that of the last part, where we are referring to. The first is, of course, the concern is that when it comes to the question of the private promotion, number one reading of this report is unbridled expansion. Although they call this as, it calls for rejuvenation, active promotion and support for private, this of course they add this qualification, philanthropic activity in the education sector. I doubt what they mean by philanthropic. As somebody was commented, a philosopher, there is something called as philanthropic capitalism. And then when it comes to the question of a capitalism which believes that there is no conflict between the market and that of common good, that is the philanthropic capitalism. That's exactly what is coming in along with this package of policy that perhaps we are trying to, it also says private and philanthropic must also encouraged and enabled to play significant and beneficial role. So if you give a straight kind of a chick to this direction, there are no, of course, Lakshman Rao was raising a question, who would provide it? There are not many doubts, although you have to read only in between lines and look at the government. In fact, what is our objection to the private institutions? The highest quality, we all talk in terms of autonomy, freedom. Why do we talk about freedom? And why do you link that freedom with that of what could be called as a desirable requirement for the progress of mankind? I'll just quote as to what is the danger of privatizing higher education. I quote Deepak Nair, who put it very succinctly. He said, there are several saner voices cautioning on the dangers of privatization of higher education. Perhaps, I would say, perhaps the message could not be better than what Deepak Nair puts it. What are the dangers of privatization of higher education? He feels there are clear answers to reflect upon. Markets should not decide on academic curricula and research agenda. Teaching and research cannot simply be seen as about use value and exchange value. It's much more than that. The objects of higher education cannot be efficiency and profits. Individual conduct gets driven by self-interest rather than common interest. The ultimate danger lies in the erosion of values and ethics in the university community that could damage the credibility, if not reputation, of universities, which play a critical role as guardians of an open society. Indeed, the integrity of the independence of intellectuals in universities, respected by citizens and society, constitute our institutional mechanism of checks and balances in a polity which is democracy. And therefore, when it comes to the question of, let's say, our objection or our fear, is that if you unbridled expansion, I mean, it's clear, because this particular government, it has to be read along with this, what perhaps it is doing, without referring to, see, even again, I come back to draft proposal. Kasturi Rangan was conscious of 6%. He can't forget, because 60-year-old unfulfilled. And then, of course, he talks in terms of, I don't know why he's personally, in sense, the committee seems to be concerned. It says, if the GDP, tax GDP ratio doesn't increase, how is it possible? He says, possibly you can think in terms of some education cess or corporate social responsibility contribution, or some kind of, let's say, common contributions. I mean, he is concerned that how to reach the 6%. Then he also specifically mentions you work along with the states on the ways and means of mobilizing 6% of GDP for education sector. And of course, what comes to that of higher education, you would see that there has been drastic decline in allocation to that of higher education over a period of time. And then I don't know how to revive it. I think somewhere it is hardly 0.8%. Substantial part, 70% of expenditure now on higher education is the state governments. Of the total expenditure on higher education is only 0.85% of GDP. Of that, almost 70% is done by expenditure by states. But you, without taking states on board, you are discussing an education policy and talking in terms of higher education of the nature where by 2040, India would be second to none, which is misleading, or rather, let's say, deceptive. And therefore, like many other things said, see, for instance, Rangarajan committee also says, if it is not immediately possible, graded kind of increase in expenditure on higher education in general. See, he starts with that of an average expenditure of 10% by both state and center put together. On the budgets, they spend 10% on education. He says that it could be in the next 10 years, from 2020 to that of, let's say, 2030, increase it gradually every year by 1% to that of 20% of the center state average expenditure on education as a whole, which means higher education would also get, let's say, substantially more. And you may also reach the target. But this document of 2020 entirely drops it. No consultation with the state, no reference, and no reference to that of how to raise resources. And then how, for instance, when it comes to the question of higher education, how it has been, no, there is an argument that India neglected school education in favor of, let's say, higher education. What is that they have spent? It is true that school education was neglected. It doesn't mean that it is favored enormously higher education. In fact, if you look at 51 to 71, higher education got 25% of the total education budget. But by 90s, it has come down to that of, by let's say, the end of 90s, 2000, it has come to that of 7% of the total education budget. And that's how it ends up with that of, let's say, this is exact figure. The state spent 0.59% of the national income on higher education, and the center spent 0.30% of the GDP on higher education, together 0.89%. And therefore, when it comes to the, in fact, even in the skewed, what is the center doing? If you look at the UGC's expenditure, 65% of UGC's expenditure is to that of, let's say, 3% of the institutions, which are central universities and other institutions like IIMs, IITs, and 35% of the UGC expenditure is for 97% of the state universities. I mean, it's very little, and that also will go down now. And in fact, all this talk of RUSA and all that, it didn't bring much. But I think looking forward to ever since this government has taken over, there has been enormous increase in the costs, even in the private sector, education. And then when of course, the results of, as I was referring to, the 75th round NSS is not released, and therefore you can't do that. But what we can see is the efforts to raise resources by the center or help the states to raise, because there are two things. Even if the states have to raise more resources, center must help. What is the center doing? See, that when it comes to the question of, let's say, the center, there is a very difficult, I mean, this is being debated. It must be put in context of education as well. When you refer to that of state share, the 14th Finance Commission recommended 42% of the so-called devolvo, that's the distributable central revenues, to the states. And constitutionally, there are certain things which cannot be distributed to states. That is, I think, what we call as central government levying cess or other kinds of duties. Not, of course, taxes. The tax revenue, as it comes, it is shareable 42%. What this government has done in the very first year after 14th Finance Commission recommendation, it did not want to, let's say, allow the resources flow to that of the state government. The very first year, the center, this is what it has done is it has taken a route of what is called levying cesses. There is education cess, keep increasing it. There is some other cess for some other purpose. There are 35 varieties of cesses imposed by the center. And these cesses are not amenable for sharing with the states. That means a commission says give 42%. You start, let's say, not without raising taxes. If you raise taxes, state government get a share. You go in for the method of cess instead of raising taxes by 1%, you say that 1% is the cess. That is not share. So what is the result? And the state governments are spending 70% of the total higher education expenditure. They must get more from the center. But what is what is happening to states' share of the gross? If you take into consideration the cess imposed by the center and the taxes collected by center, 35% is the only amount. The first year, 2015, only 35% of gross revenue of the center goes to that of states. It is because substantial part of this, what is substantial part? Here is, I think, what estimates made by former chairman or chairman of the 14th Finance Commission, Y.V. Reddy and G.R. Reddy in their book. They say that the cess as a central revenue, which was about 3% in 2000, has increased to that of 16.5%. That means instead of raising taxes, you are raising cess. You don't have to share it with the state governments. It looks like you're fooling 14th Finance Commission, saying that they raised 42%, but you are giving what? This is what they have given. In 2015-16 of the gross revenues, 35%, 19-20, 32%, and this year it would be 30%. See, where is 42% recommended? Where is 30% you are giving to states? How can states bear the additional burden of, we may be critical of states starving higher education here. where are states getting additional revenue so that they could also put some more money into higher education. The state government, I am not justifying, may not be looking at, Andhra Pradesh may be looking at only school, but not a higher education, because this game is also there, that they don't get additional resources. Therefore, wherever they get votes, they put that money in school education. Is good, but they are not able to look at it. So this method adopted by the center, for instance, even it's a gross violation what this government is doing. For instance, I'm sorry. Let me specifically refer to that of educational cess imposed by the central government. For instance, we started with education cess in 2004, 2% on central tax, raised it by 1 more percent in 2009. So it collected between 2010 and then 2020, last 20 years, it collected 3.38 lakh crores as education cess. Of course, this is education at the school level. But it has spent, it has transferred. These are all separate funds to be transferred for that purpose. Cess can't be used as what is called as consolidated central government fund. It can't go there. It should go to, what they have done is they transferred only 2.21 lakhs to this school fund, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, kept it itself 1.1 lakh crores. I mean, if this is the way, I mean, even if you impose a specific purpose tax for such a critical thing as that of school education, and if you swindle it, it is swindling from the state. Let me not get into that of GST, what they are doing. Now, the question is, if your so-called ambitious new education policy aims to make India second to none by 2040, by bringing in multidisciplinary large higher education institutions, if the road taken is through that of privatization, and the road taken is ignoring the role of the state, in a context where we have already seen every rupee that is being generated as national income, 66 paise is going to the top 10%. If that is not touched, additional resources are not raised, it will only become, let's say, mere rhetoric and outright cheating of the country. And this is the substance of this policy without any, let's say, basis that it is trying to resort to that of high sounding rhetoric. It's nothing short of, let's say, it talks, the Prime Minister said, it revolutionizes education system in India. Nothing short of a mobilization, social mobilization of a scale that perhaps exposes the deception involved in the substance of the policy. There is no way that we will have a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable higher education that benefits particularly the large section which has been bypassed for centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderfully researched presentation with detailed statistics. We're fortunate enough to have a clear perspective of what NEP 2020 means. And we thank you, see, for the labor that you have put into it, body and soul, into the presentation. Now it is over to Mr. Moses to propose vote of thanks. Dr. Moses, from AC College.
Good morning to you all. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on the occasion of the 12th MJM Memorial Lecture on 16/11/2020. I take this opportunity to thank the MJM committee for providing an opportunity to AC College management to host this webinar. I thank our beloved principal, Dr. T. Anita Susan, for the welcome address. I thank Dr. S. Shankar for his introduction to the topic of the webinar. I express my gratitude to Dr. Chukka Esratnangaru for his secretary's report. I thank our beloved Sri T. Rangarao Garu for the presidential report about our MJM committee. I am thankful to Sri K.S. Lakshman Rao Garu, MLC, for briefing the participants about the significance of the webinar.
Moses, voice miss out on Moses. Moses, audio clear ga ledu.
I am thankful to Professor D. Narasimha Reddy Garu, Professor of Economics retired, University of Hyderabad, for his endowment lecture on role of state in implementing equitability and sustainable higher education. I thank all the staff of AC College who participated in today's program. I thank all the participants and lecturers from various colleges in Guntur. My special thanks to Sri Vijay Kumar Garu and Mrs. Vijay Kumar Garu for his active participation in this webinar. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you so much,
Gopal
Moses.
Shankar Garu.
And now, yeah. Thank you so much, Moses.
Sir,
We're indebted to the
Shankar Garu.
MJM Memorial Committee and yeah. Rangarao, we're logging out. Rangarao, thanks to Moses. Moses,
Okay, sir.
anything else? Anything else?
We are closing this session. Thank you, one and all.
Yeah. We can log out of it. Thank you so much.